Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe through creaking wooden floors and into the hushed heart of a 19th century library where the threat wasn't theft or fire or even poor shelving habits, but a good old-fashioned draft. That's right, the kind of innocent breeze you might enjoy on a spring afternoon was public enemy number one to the cardigan-clad guardians of knowledge. And you're about to find out why. You shuffle forward in thick woolen socks that slip just slightly on the polished parquet, past shelves stacked with bound volumes so old they seem to inhale and exhale when no one's looking. Outside, the trees rustle with an evening wind, but in here, it's as still as an abandoned tea party because heaven forbid a window be cracked. Now, spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't have survived this job unless you had an iron immune system and a passionate loathing of open windows. That's your reality check for the evening. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time, especially if you're tuning in from a drafty room of your own. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive just after dawn, tea still warm in your gloved hands, to your new post as assistant keeper of periodicals at the municipal library of slightly unsettling but ultimately very respectable town. The head librarian meets you at the door. She's draped in a tartan shawl the size of a sail, with pince-nez glasses that make her look like she could vaporize you with a single disappointed glance. She doesn't ask if you're excited. She asks without blinking if you've ever accidentally opened a window. Your job, she explains, is not merely to guard books from sticky fingers, but from air itself. Here's your first mainstream historical fact. By the mid-1800s, libraries were beginning to fill with rare and fragile books often printed on acidic paper or bound with materials prone to decay. Drafts brought fluctuations in temperature and moisture that could buckle pages, fade inks, and cause devastating outbreaks of mold, or foxing those brown age spots you sometimes see in old books. To the modern reader, a breeze might feel harmless, even refreshing. But to a Victorian librarian, it was a silent, invisible assassin, armed with humidity and chaos. If books could speak, they'd probably scream at the sound of a creaking casement. And now for your quirky tidbit, some libraries went so far as to hang strips of horsehair from their window frames, not to keep bugs out, but to monitor airflow. If the horsehair moved, someone was in trouble. There's even one recorded incident where a volunteer assistant was quietly transferred to a lighthouse posting after he left a clerestory window open for 5 minutes. The scandal was referred to as the breach of the East Arch. Historians still argue whether the draft obsession was purely about conservation or partly about control. After all, controlling a space's temperature is also a way of controlling who stays there and for how long. Some scholars believe the fear of drafts overlapped neatly with a desire to discourage loiterers, wanderers, and anyone who might have too much body heat or enthusiasm. So here you are, being shown to your corner desk beneath a suspiciously sealed window. There's an ink blotter, a logbook, and a thick felt draft stopper resting along the sill like a sleepy snake. You may document everything. The head librarian intones, "Accept your feelings." The air in the library is still but heavy. You imagine it has texture like oversteeped tea or a forgotten velvet coat. A moth flutters lazily past your elbow. You're not sure if it's been alive for 5 minutes or 50 years. You settle in, unwrap your sandwich very quietly, obviously, and begin copying titles from the morning delivery into the registry ledger. You are very careful not to breathe near the books. Outside, a bird sings. Inside, your lungs barely dare to participate. You think about opening the window, just a crack, just for air, just to know you still can. You touch the latch. A voice, seemingly from nowhere, says, "Don't." You jerk back. There's no one in sight. You decide to go count the index cards again, just in case. The hours pass in inky silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the polite coughing of a fellow cataloger trying not to die of cold. you're starting to understand that being a librarian here isn't about loving books. It's about surviving them. You begin to notice it around mid-morning, this quiet but firm vigilance, not from the patrons, who mostly sit like statues behind newspapers or leaf slowly through dusty atlases. No, the real watchfulness comes from the librarians themselves, who glide silently between aisles like cloaked sentinels, eyes darting to every window, every door, every slight shift in air. They don't trust anything that moves, especially not the atmosphere. One woman, a cataloger named Miss Pym, who smells faintly of linseed oil and disapproval, pauses at a west-facing window, adjusts the thick velvet curtain by exactly 1 inch, and then writes something in a tiny notebook. You don't ask what. You already know. The breeze has been monitored. See, in the 19th century, librarians didn't just shelve books and shush people. They fought a silent war against entropy, armed with feather dusters, knitting needles, and stern glances. And at the top of their hit list, drafts. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Many 19th century libraries were housed in old stone buildings with poor insulation and large, leaky windows. Before the widespread use of central heating, any crack or draft could cause a sharp fluctuation in temperature and humidity. This made fragile paper expand and contract, rapidly weakening spines, loosening bindings, and sometimes even causing pages to ripple or tear. So yes, one cold snap could do more damage than a burglar with a crowbar. Some libraries even posted signs above their windows that read things like, "Drafts are the death of books," which sounds dramatic, until you realize that it was, for all intents and purposes, true. They weren't exaggerating, they were mourning. And for today's quirky tidbit, one particularly zealous librarian in Edinburgh reportedly invented a small hand fan made of goose feathers that she used to redirect any air she suspected was aiming for her bookshelves. It looked a bit like an aristocratic badminton paddle. She called it the wind ward. Historians still argue whether this level of paranoia was entirely justified. Yes, temperature and humidity affect books, but the obsession with drafts may have been rooted as much in cultural anxiety as scientific reasoning. Some experts believe the draft-fearing librarian was as much a symbol of Victorian order and propriety as she was a caretaker of books, protecting the sanctity of knowledge from the uncouth messiness of nature. A breeze, after all, was unpredictable, and unpredictability was unacceptable. Back at your post, you test this theory. You place a single sheet of thin paper on your desk and crack open your leather-bound notepad. Then quickly, guiltily, you breathe on the page. Just a puff. It curls. A little. Maybe. You hear someone clear their throat behind you. You straighten up. The page goes flat again. Miss Pym glides by. Careful, she says, without looking at you. Exhalation has been known to fade marginalia. You wonder if she's joking. She is not. Librarians during this time were already developing preservation methods still in use today. But since they didn't have climate control, they improvised. They taped seams in window panes with waxed linen strips. They rotated book displays to minimize exposure to sunbeams. Some even draped shelves with netting soaked in vinegar to capture air impurities. You're not sure how effective this was, but it definitely gave the place a vibe. Your own library is beginning to feel more like a bunker. The silence, the heavy curtains, the crackling fire in the iron stove that someone's definitely stoked too aggressively. It all gives the impression that you're not preserving knowledge, but protecting it from some kind of natural disaster, or worse, a mild breeze. You make your way through the map room, a cathedral of parchment and curled corners. The windows here have been boarded from the inside, not with ugly planks, but with framed paintings of maps. A clever disguise. The air is stiff and dry, like the room hasn't inhaled since Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. You brush a bit of dust from a globe. It squeaks softly. In the corner sits an elderly man in a three-piece suit, asleep in a chair. A copy of the Geography of Spheres open on his lap. You wonder how long he's been here. Days, weeks. Has anyone checked? And then, at last, you reach a window. A real one. A tall, wood-framed sash, with a pane that's cracked, not open, just literally cracked. A tiny spider web of glass splinters in the corner. You reach out instinctively, not to open it, just to feel how cold the glass is. Your hand hovers. Don't. The voice again. You turn. It's the head librarian. She's standing perfectly still behind you, like she materialized from the shadows. "We're not insured for that kind of recklessness," she says. You withdraw your hand. Outside, the wind picks up a bit, fluttering the leaves of the oak trees. You swear they wave at you mockingly. Inside, the only thing fluttering is your sense of personal freedom. Later that afternoon, you find yourself in a heated, chilled discussion in the cataloging alcove. The topic: windows. The subtopic: whether the sash windows on the north side should be nailed shut permanently or simply sealed with beeswax and a heartfelt prayer. Miss Pym, who is emerging as both the spiritual and tactical leader of the anti-draft faction, makes her argument first. "It's not just the temperature," she says, tapping a stack of pamphlets with enough force to suggest they've been personally victimized by condensation. "It's the turbulence." Opposing her, Mr. Baldrick, keeper of the library's geological section, and a man who has never encountered a sedimentary rock he couldn't monologue about, believes airflow is necessary. Stale air causes rot. He insists it's simple biology. He gestures vaguely at a poster depicting the ideal temperature range for ancient vellum. A bit of breeze now and again wouldn't kill anyone. Miss Pym fixes him with the kind of look usually reserved for people who write in books with ink pens. Here's your mainstream historical fact. The sash window, invented in the 17th century and wildly popular by the 1800s, became both a godsend and a nightmare. It allowed for ventilation in tall buildings, but its tendency to stick, rattle, or drop suddenly turned it into a maintenance headache. Libraries built during the Georgian and Victorian eras were often filled with these windows, and librarians took to creating all kinds of modifications: pulley locks, wax seals, draft excluders, and even warning labels. The battle wasn't just against air, it was against physics. Today's quirky tidbit: a library in Norwich is said to have employed a man whose sole job was to open and close windows in accordance with the day's paper sensitivity. He carried a barometer, a humidity gauge, and a rather dramatic cloak. Staff referred to him, only half-jokingly, as the weather whisperer. Historians still argue whether the entire anti-draft hysteria stemmed from real experience or from one or two catastrophic incidents that became cautionary legends. One oft-repeated story tells of a first edition of The Wealth of Nations being ruined when a breeze from a cracked sash blew soot from a nearby fireplace directly into its binding. Whether this actually happened or was simply librarian folklore remains unclear, but its influence was lasting. You're beginning to see that windows in libraries weren't just architectural features. They were active combatants in a preservation Cold War. Librarians didn't open the window. They negotiated with it. Mid-debate, Miss Pym announces she's initiating a window accountability log. Every half hour, someone will inspect each window's latch, curtain, and surrounding air for signs of movement. You are, naturally, volunteered to begin. Your first round takes 26 minutes. You inspect 37 windows. You note that window 14B rattles slightly if you stomp your foot nearby. Window 22C has a suspicious smudge that may or may not be frost. Window 7F, well, that one just looks like it's thinking about betrayal. In the reading room, a boy sneezes near a closed window. 3 librarians flinch in unison. You make your way to the second floor, past the travel journals and the nautical fiction section. There, in a room called the solarium, ironic, given it sees no sun, you find an open ledger detailing the historical draft incidents of 1876. There are diagrams, marginalia. One entry reads, excessive air movement, parchment quivered, closed window, lit incense to stabilize morale. It's as if the windows themselves are characters in this story, tricksters, saboteurs, fickle beings capable of unraveling centuries of knowledge with one casual breath of spring. You make your final notes and return to your desk. Miss Pym reads your entries without comment. Then she nods and says, "You may now qualify for gloves without fingers. This is apparently a promotion. You're cold, but somehow proud. Your job is absurd, yes, but it's also strangely noble. You're not just a clerk. You're part of an invisible army, fighting against impermanence." Page by page, as evening descends, you see it again. The tiny shutter of the curtain near the west stacks. No one else is watching. The latch is down, but still, it stirs. And you understand now. It's not just about paper. It's about trust. You start to realize, as the evenings grow longer and the candle wax pools more slowly, that this library is not merely obsessed with stillness, it cultivates it, protects it like a rare orchid. But the real villain, not fire, not flood, not even that suspicious gentleman who tried to walk off with a whole box of almanacs in '73. No. The enemy is mold, the sneaky, fuzzy, creeping specter of decay. And the librarians have declared war. Miss Pym, ever the sentinel, leads you to the rare works room. Entry is permitted only after a triple inspection of your hands washed, dried, and lightly powdered with starch, your clothing no open wool knits, and your breath no tea stronger than chamomile allowed. The moment you cross the threshold, you feel the difference. The air is still dry and slightly dusty like parchment might, if it could exhale. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mold outbreaks in 19th century libraries could destroy entire collections. Without climate control, spores thrived in warm, humid air. Once mold set into a volume, it spread rapidly, discoloring pages, weakening glue, and attracting insects. Librarians often rotated books on the shelves, aired rooms briefly and under supervision, and isolated contaminated books for treatment, usually by gently scraping them with ivory tools and laying them under sun lamps. And now, your quirky tidbit. Some librarians began referring to mold outbreaks with absurdly genteel code phrases. In one London archive, the fox is in the hen house meant mold had been found in the medieval charters. In another, the phrase Lord Dampnut is calling was whispered if mildew was detected in the theological section. Yes, really. Historians still argue whether the intense fear of mold led to more harm than good. Some early interventions like baking books in ovens or dousing them with vinegar tinctures did more damage than the mold itself. But it's hard to blame them. When your enemy is silent, invisible, and potentially in every page, paranoia is inevitable. In this rare works room, the books rest on angled shelves, not upright, not stacked. Angled, so air can flow behind them, even though it's barely moving. The room smells of old leather, dry ink, and the faint mineral scent of limestone dust. A journal from 1802 sits open under a sheet of fine muslin. You are allowed to turn one page using a flat, ivory paddle, not your fingers. The page sighs when moved. You're not sure if it's relief or resentment. Then there's the mold map, a hand-drawn floor plan showing every past outbreak, color-coded by severity. The Great Bloom of '49 seems to have claimed an entire aisle. Summer of Spores is noted in the music section with tiny black X's. You are given a brush made of boar hair. It's softer than it sounds. Your task? Gently sweep the spines of the poetry collection. You are told not to look too hard at the titles, less distraction. More vigilance. You try. You really do. But it's difficult not to notice some of them. Odes to a Teacup, The Ballad of Slightly Damp Shoes, and something called Elegy for a Cracked Pane. As you work, a new librarian joins you. A man named Wexley. His voice is barely above a whisper. His shoes make no sound, and he claims to have once smelled mold before it was visible. You decide not to question this. Together, you inspect the ventilation system, which in this room consists of small ceiling vents covered by paper doilies. These are changed every 2 days. Not for beauty. Wexley tells you solemnly, for airflow modulation. Then he adds, and maybe a little for beauty. You respect the honesty. You begin to understand that to these librarians, mold is not just a problem. It's an existential threat. It's what comes for books when humans get lazy. It's the forest trying to take back the page. When you leave the rare works room, you feel lighter. Not because you're glad to be out, but because the air is slightly more humid in the hallway. You hadn't realized just how perfectly dry it was until you left. And now you know. The windows stay shut not because the librarians hate fresh air, they just hate anything that might wake the mold. You head downstairs toward the library's underbelly, the basement, or, as the librarians call it in hushed tones, the archive vaults. It's cooler down here, and darker, and far less hospitable to both mold and joy. You duck beneath low beams, pass under iron gas lamps that were never fully electrified, and trail your fingers along a stone wall that seems to sweat cold air. You swear it exhales like the books above. A heavy wooden door creaks open, revealing rows of ledger cabinets and temperature charts dating back to 1831. There's a book of graphs, all hand-drawn and quivering ink lines, showing fluctuations in temperature and barometric pressure with commentary like Windows 6B suspected. You wonder if any of this was effective. But then again, the books are still here. Here's your mainstream historical fact. 19th century librarians, lacking digital sensors or dehumidifiers, often relied on barometers, thermometers, and sheer obsessive note-taking to track environmental conditions. Some libraries kept weather logs more detailed than their local meteorological stations. Preservation, after all, was half science, half superstition, which brings you to the quirky tidbit of this section. A small brass bell, labeled the emergency draft bell, hangs from the ceiling of the basement stairwell. If anyone upstairs spotted an unauthorized open window, they were to ring this bell and shout "loose air." This would trigger a full floor sweep and window lockdown procedure. The bell hasn't been rung in over 70 years. Still, it's polished weekly, just in case. Historians still argue whether the extreme procedures these libraries implemented actually helped more than they hindered. Some say the overemphasis on preserving the physical condition of books may have led to decades of knowledge being locked away, untouched, too fragile to access. Others argue the care taken ensured those books could still be accessed centuries later. It's a preservation paradox. Protect something too much, and it becomes a relic. Protect it too little, and it disappears. You walk past a drawer marked Draft Anomalies, 1870s, and pause. Inside are dozens of tiny envelopes, each containing a clipped scrap of newspaper or parchment with notes like "page fluttered despite known seal." Each envelope is dated, timed, and signed by a librarian. These aren't jokes. These are forensic files. A thin booklet titled Guide to Airflow Espionage outlines early experiments in tracking air currents using ribbon threads, candle smoke, and your favorite specially trained moths. You chuckle. The moths, apparently, were a failure. Too easily distracted by the bindings, you climb a wrought iron spiral staircase and emerge in the mezzanine. From here, you can see the main floor of the reading room, where students, clerks, and the occasional actual scholar move about like gentle ghosts. You notice a woman sitting beneath a stained glass oculus, reading what looks to be an 1820 edition of Essays on Maritime Dampness. She's wrapped in a shawl, her tea untouched, her eyes laser-focused on a single line. You wonder what she's thinking. Then you see it, just beside her. Behind the oculus, an open window. No. You freeze. It's subtle, cracked barely half an inch, but it's open. And, more shockingly, no one seems to have noticed. Not Miss Pym, not Mr. Baldrick, not even Wexley, who supposedly dreams in humidity indexes. You feel an irrational wave of panic, like you've just discovered a ticking clock in a room full of Fabergé eggs. You glance toward the nearest bell pull. You hesitate. It's just a little air, right? Then you remember the mold map, the whispers of Lord Dampnut, the fox in the henhouse. You can't be the librarian who let it all in. You march to the window, quietly but with purpose, and press it shut with a firm clunk. No one applauds. No one even notices. But in your soul, you feel like you've won something. Back at your desk, you make a note in the window accountability log. North Oculus, cracked intervention executed. No casualties. Glory uncertain. No casualties. No breezes. Just silence. For now, the next morning, you arrive to find a sticky note. Yes, a literal sticky note. Pale yellow and square, placed with surgical precision in the center of your desk. On it, in Miss Pym's spindly hand, "Meet me in the bindery. Gloves required." You oblige. Of course. You've learned by now that resistance in this building is not only futile, it's also frowned upon in triplicate, logged, and likely turned into a cautionary tale for the next poor intern. Down in the bindery, the air smells of old paste and slightly roasted parchment. The walls are lined with spools of linen thread, iron presses, bottles of something labeled bookbone oil, and a curious contraption that looks like a medieval torture device but is apparently just a spine crimper. Miss Pym greets you with a nod. "You're here to assist with the patient," she says. "You don't ask questions. You've read enough to know you never interrupt a binder when she's speaking in capital letters." Today's mainstream historical fact: In the 19th century, bookbinding was more than just functional. It was an art form, and one carried out with methodical reverence by skilled tradespeople. Many librarians were trained in basic repair techniques. They had to be. No book survived constant use without the occasional cracked hinge, detached board, or worst of all, a spine collapse. Today's quirky tidbit. There was a running debate in certain bookbinder circles over whether cracked leather bindings should be oiled with neatsfoot oil, lanolin, or a special mixture made from egg whites and gin. Yes, gin. The egg white method supposedly reinvigorated the leather, but also had the unfortunate side effect of smelling faintly like breakfast. Historians still argue whether the elaborate 19th century rebindings improved a book's longevity or stripped it of its historical integrity. Modern archivists now consider some old repairs invasive, even damaging. But back then, if a book came apart in your hands, you fixed it quickly, and as handsomely as possible. Miss Pym lifts the patient into view, a crumbling volume of an annotated index of faint breezes in ecclesiastical architecture. You wouldn't call it thrilling reading. You wouldn't even call it reading. But this book, she informs you, was found flaking into despair in the architectural reference section. Your job is to gently remove the spine liner with a bone folder. An ivory tool that's both satisfying to hold and mildly intimidating. Miss Pym supervises like a hawk wearing bifocals. With every delicate peel of linen thread and dried glue, you feel like you're undressing history. Underneath the outer layer, someone has scribbled a name. T.H. Lowther, 1834. You whisper it aloud, mostly because the silence demands some kind of reverence. Miss Pym gives a single approving grunt. She teaches you how to reinforce the inner hinge using Japanese paper, a method not invented in Europe until the late 1800s, and initially considered too exotic for Western tomes. Now, it's the gold standard for ethical conservation. You're shown how to tighten a corner fold, how to press warped covers under a velvet weight, how to whisper gently to a book as if it's a sleepy cat who might claw your face if startled. An hour passes. Then, too, you lose track of time. Eventually, the binding is restored, not perfect, but presentable. Miss Pym ties it with twine and writes on a card, repaired with unorthodox hands. Monitor for relapse. You beam. She doesn't smile, but her eyebrow arches in something almost warm. Later, back upstairs, you hear a crash. A student has dropped a stack of dictionaries. 3 librarians flinch. One faints dramatically, and onto a chaise longue someone pushed under them at the last second. Standard protocol. You run downstairs with a cloth sling, prepared to cradle the injured volumes. Thankfully, the dictionaries are fine, mostly bruised pride. You return to your desk and see that someone, probably Wexley, has added a note to your logbook. Binder's hands achieved. Next, do check training. Do check. You shudder slightly. You take a breath. You smell faint paste on your fingertips. The warm scent of glue lingers like nostalgia. Somewhere in the stacks, a clock ticks solemnly, the way only library clocks can. You press your logbook closed. The patient rests beside you, newly whole. And for once, the windows don't creak. You knew it was coming. The phrase had been lurking on the edge of every hallway conversation, tucked beneath layers of dust and decorum, like a secret button in a Victorian waistcoat. Do check training. The phrase alone makes your socks feel damp. Wexley greets you near the main staircase with a clipboard, a pocket barometer, and a grim nod that implies someone probably once died doing this. Humidity patrol, he says solemnly. It's time. So you follow him, clipboard in hand, into the deepest shelves. The poetry stacks, the folklore nook, the alcove of books so unused even the mice ask for directions. The goal, monitor the air for signs of excessive moisture, as if tracking an elusive and slightly emotional cloud that prefers rhyming couplets. Your mainstream historical fact for today: 19th century libraries were obsessed with maintaining low indoor humidity, ideally between 30–50%, too dry, and the pages became brittle. Too damp, and mold, insects, and book warping became inevitable. Some librarians even installed bowls of salt or silica gel hidden among the books, long before anyone thought of the word dehumidifier. Now for a quirky tidbit: In at least 3 confirmed cases, librarians of the late 1800s conducted book sweating tests, where a small bowl of rice or flour was placed on top of a book overnight. If it clumped by morning, humidity was excessive and traitorous. One Boston library used dried beans. Another just watched how quickly biscuits went soggy on a shelf. Historians still argue whether these makeshift tests had any real scientific merit. Some say they were quaint but ineffective. Others argue they were surprisingly consistent with modern digital sensors. Proof that a well-calibrated biscuit never lies. Your first assigned zone is Shelf 9C Travel Journals of Slightly Forgettable Expeditions. The titles range from Meandering Through Mid-Wales to A Week in the Belgian Flatlands. Rain Log. You uncap your tiny hygrometer and note the reading. 49%. Close, but acceptable. Wexley peeks over your shoulder. 9C always flirts with danger, he whispers, like it's a personal betrayal. He hands you a small roll of what looks like pinkish string, wool thread. Cut 3 6-inch segments. Place one behind the books, one inside the shelf lip, one above the row. Check in 20 minutes. If they curl, we have a seep. A seep, you learn, is the sinister cousin of a draft. Drafts move boldly. Seeps arrive slowly, clinging to corners, making the paper fibers gently swell like bread dough. You carry on, testing other trouble zones. The hymnals near the radiator always suspicious. The cookbook archives which seem oddly warm, and the tiny staircase that leads to a half-floor known only as the Whisper Gallery. In the Whisper Gallery, even your breathing feels too loud. You read a sign taped to the wall. Beware. This stairwell once fogged a folio. At this point, you're starting to develop an ear for moisture. You swear you can hear when paper has thickened slightly, like when someone dunks a cracker in tea and then regrets it. You log your readings. You clip your strings. You learn to detect the difference between ordinary must and dangerous murk. Wexley makes tea no milk, never milk. Too humid and tells you a story about the Great Dew Incident of 1883, when a freak thunderstorm forced open a south window and led to the tragic blooming of the colonial records. It was said the book smelled like celery for a week. He hands you a small amulet on a cord, a tiny bronze goat. For good luck, he mutters. Found it near the Irish maps. No one claimed it. You don't ask. You simply accept it, loop it around your wrist, and pat it once like a tiny charm of professional solidarity. That night, you dream of paper curling in slow motion, of barometers ticking up like sinister clocks, of biscuits crumbling, one by one, under spectral fingers. You wake up and immediately check your socks. Dry. Thank goodness. You stretch, brush the sleep from your eyes, and reach for the clipboard. There's work to do. The dew waits for no librarian. The next morning, you report to the second-floor map room, not because you've been summoned, but because you've heard whispers, literal whispers, drifting down from the vents above the poetry wing. Something about a cartographic emergency, which, in this library, might mean anything from a missing compass rose to a mold attack on the Balkans. The map room greets you with the musty scent of vellum and vinegar glue. It's colder than the rest of the building, partly due to its distance from the radiators, but also, according to Wexley, because of historic air layering. You don't know what that means. You pretend you do. Today's mainstream historical fact: 19th century libraries held enormous collections of hand-drawn maps, maritime charts, border negotiations. River deltas traced in maddening detail. Some were rolled tightly and shelved vertically like scrolls. Others were laid flat in enormous drawers that librarians opened with both reverence and back pain. And now, the quirky tidbit. Several British and Polish libraries allegedly designated map whisperers, staff members with unusually gentle fingertips and steady breaths. Their job, to unroll delicate maps and flatten creases without inducing even a tremble. In one case, the requirement was that you had to be able to extinguish a candle from 6 feet away using only your breath, so as to prove you had the lung control to move a page but not a particle. Historians still argue whether the elaborate air protocols surrounding map collections were based in science or simply theatrical flair. Some claim the cold rooms prevented curling and ink bleed. Others say the low temperature was just an excuse to wear those dramatic fingerless gloves all year. Today, the crisis involves a maritime chart of the Norwegian coast dated 1821. The ink is fading, the parchment is curling, and someone, perhaps a student, perhaps a ghost, left a paperweight on its edge, causing a faint ripple in the southwest fjords. Your mission? Flatten the map using passive humidity, which, unfortunately, involves sitting in the cold room for at least 2 hours with a steaming mug of mint tea placed gently on the floor nearby. The tea isn't for you, it's for the air. Controlled tea diffusion. The note reads, "No sloshing. You sit, you wait, you stare at the map." There's a smudge near Bergen that looks like a seal, not the ink kind. The animal. You name him Lionel and decide he probably judged 19th century sailors harshly. Time drips by. You blink slowly. The tea loses its warmth. You breathe with intention, careful not to fog the glass. Eventually, the curl lessens. Just enough. You reach for the corner, lift it with your goat-charmed wrist, and press it down with a sandbag the size of a grapefruit. A good sign. No crinkling, no screaming. A small bell chimes. Lunch. But you don't move yet. You take another few minutes to stare at the map, wondering how anyone ever trusted their lives to ink and guesses. One badly drawn island. And suddenly you're shipwrecked on probably just a shadow. Back in the main reading hall, you pass the atlas table. Miss Pym is carefully brushing off the surface of a 1782 French globe with what appears to be a squirrel-haired toothbrush. She doesn't look up. You hear someone ask, "Is the Adriatic still sticky?" Someone else replies, "Only if you touch it." You leave them to it. Later, you log your map room shift. Humidity proxy deployed. No paper losses. Lionel remains at large. You tuck the goat charm back into your pocket. It's a little warmer now. Maybe that's just you. You stretch your fingers and glance toward the History of Cartography section, where a book titled Cautious Navigation and Its Consequences calls softly from the top shelf. You smile. Tomorrow, maybe. For now, you've sailed the Norwegian coast and lived to tell the tale. You don't expect to be summoned by envelope. But here you are holding a heavy cream card, inked in elegant script. Expedition to the Roof Library. Midnight. Bring scarf. No name. No sender. Just the unmistakable handwriting of Mr. Baldrick, the head of subterranean classifications, whose idea of casual conversation involves footnotes. So you wait. Midnight arrives. You wrap your scarf, grab your flashlight, and take the spiral staircase that leads above the highest stacks past the dusty astronomy section and through a bolted door marked Staff Only, Draft Interruption Team. You unlock it with the brass key Miss Pym left accidentally on your desk. Above, the air is thin and dry. You emerge into the roof library, a long-forgotten attic turned archive, lined with casement windows and insulated with ancient felt. It smells like insulation and secrets. In the corner stands Baldrick, adjusting a portable barometer and sipping from a thermos. "Watch for icicles," he says. "They signal guilt." You don't ask. Your mainstream historical fact: some 19th century libraries extended into their rooftops, using those upper spaces as temporary storage, astronomy observatories, or even emergency reading rooms, weather permitting. Few visitors came up here. Fewer books ever returned. These lofts became forgotten sanctuaries for fragile volumes that couldn't survive human enthusiasm. And your quirky tidbit: in 1878, a German librarian built a pigeon loft on his library roof, training the birds to deliver overdue notices to students too lazy to return borrowed volumes. Legend has it, one particularly vengeful pigeon took out a student's monocle. Historians still argue whether these roof libraries were practical solutions or charming liabilities. Some believe the microclimate offered rare preservation conditions. Others argue they were simply accidents waiting to happen. What with the rain, the wind, and the occasional falcon? Tonight, your mission is to monitor the barometric pressure near the north-facing rafters, where a rare first edition of Moisture and the Morality of Empire is showing signs of spine warping. The book, housed in a velvet-lined cradle, seems perfectly still. But Baldrick is unconvinced. We felt something last Tuesday, he says. A twitch. Together, you set to work, placing dehumidifying sachets filled with dried rosemary and desiccated orange peels around the perimeter. Baldric prefers natural desiccants. Chemicals confuse the pages, he mutters. You light a single beeswax candle in the corner. For equilibrium, he explains. You suspect it's more for the ambiance? As the wind rattles the old glass panes, you check the internal temperature. 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Optimal, Baldric whispers, as if cold air has ears. You check the book's pages. No further curling, no ink bleeding. But one of the velvet ties has shifted slightly. You straighten it with one finger, and the book seems to settle, exhaling centuries of caution. Baldric scribbles in his logbook. You write your own entry on the back of your bookmark. Roof stable, no atmospheric misbehavior. Falcon probability, low. Then, just as you prepare to leave, you hear a sound, a soft knock. From beneath the floorboards, Baldric freezes. Not again, he says. You follow him to a corner hatch, where a small stairwell leads down to a mezzanine between the roof and the ceiling beams. Baldric shines his flashlight. There, huddled on a tartan blanket, is Wexley eating shortbread and reading secret drafts and where to find them. This is my humidity isolation break, Wexley says. You didn't see me. Baldric sighs. Next time, at least log it. Back at your desk an hour later, you sip tea and reread your notes. Your scarf still smells like attic air distant and a little suspicious. You write one last line before bed. No new drafts. Roof library. Intact. Wexley remains feral. It starts with a whisper in the cloakroom. Something about a shelf collapse. Not the dramatic kind, no thunderous cascade of encyclopedias, no domino toppling of dusty volumes. Just a quiet, invisible failure somewhere in the dewy 640s. Domestic arts. One shelf, one wobble. One book too many on Victorian marmalade techniques. You're handed a toolkit. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. Hammer, level, beeswax polish, cloth gloves. Go see Miss Plimsoll. Someone tells you she's in non-fiction triage. You don't question it. By now, you know that in this building, shelving is sacred geometry, and a wobbly bracket is cause for spiritual alarm. Your mainstream historical fact. 19th century libraries took great pride in their shelving systems. Oak and mahogany were common, chosen for their sturdiness and supposed book-calming energy. Shelves were often adjustable, though not easily designed to accommodate everything from leather-bound folios to unruly pamphlets that refused to stand up straight. And here's your quirky tidbit. In at least one known instance, a librarian in Edinburgh documented the moaning of distressed shelves in his nightly log. It's believed he meant the creaking of wood under pressure. But a few romantics insist the shelves were haunted by the emotional weight of poorly written biographies. Historians still argue whether library carpentry should be considered part of formal librarian training. Some institutions offered full shelving apprenticeships. Others saw the skill as separate, left to skilled joiners or retired sea captains with a knack for plumb lines. Miss Plimsoll greets you at the triage zone, an open nook lit with a single reading lamp and guarded by a velvet rope. She is short, stern, and wears bifocals so thick they double as tiny time machines. Books are patient, she says. Shelves are not. The shelf in question leans ever so slightly. To an untrained eye, it looks fine. To Miss Plimsoll, it looks like imminent disaster. You run your fingers along the wood. There's a subtle give near the back brace. You kneel down, gently ease the books aside. Preserves of the British Isles, efficient tea table settings, tatting, and you examine the screws. Loose, just enough. Plimsoll hands you a tiny wooden wedge. Victorian, she says. Maple, from a retired spice rack. You tap it in with a mallet. Steady the brace, and retighten the supports with slow, reverent care. The shelf exhales. You don't imagine it. The weight redistributes. A gentle thunk tells you the structure has forgiven you. You polish the edges, not because they need it, but because Miss Plimsoll is watching. She places a single copper coin on the shelf. Test weight, she says. We use old halfpennies. If it rolls, we rebuild. It doesn't roll. You're handed a tiny stamp, not a date stamp. This one has a pine cone etched in its head. You press it into a card labeled Structural Intervention. Class B. Below that, you add your initials and the time, 17. Plimsoll nods once. You're ready for the rolling ladders. You don't know what that means. You suspect you'll find out. Before you leave, she hands you a lint cloth. For your satchel, she says. Too much dust signals neglect. We notice. On the way back to the main floor, you pause near a shelf of instructional manuals on 18th century breakfast table etiquette. One of them winks at you. Not literally, just in that way, old books have folded corners. Uneven binding. A ripple in the spine. You adjust it gently. Back at your desk. You log your notes. Shelf realigned. Wedge accepted. Pine cone earned. You lean back. Stretch your spine. And hear the distant ding of a teacup being set down 2 rooms away. The shelf stands straight behind you. Not proud, just at peace. The call comes via pneumatic tube. Soft thump as the canister arrives at your station with the velocity of a slightly hesitant grapefruit. You unscrew the top and pull out a folded memo. The incident in the ink registry. Bring gloves. And citrus. You sigh. Grab your gear and head down the narrow staircase into the ink registry, a chilly, subterranean room known less for organization and more for scent. It smells of antique gum arabic, iron gall residue, and vague bitterness. The lights flicker, the floor creaks with the hesitation of someone who's seen too much ink spill and too few apologies. A dripping pipe plays percussion in the background. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the 19th century, many libraries cataloged and preserved recipes for ink, particularly iron gall ink made from tannin-rich galls, iron salts, and a binder. While popular, this ink had a nasty habit of corroding paper over decades, slowly burning through words it was supposed to preserve. Now for your quirky tidbit. One German archivist allegedly tested inks by dabbing samples on pork rind, claiming it mimicked parchment if the ink bled or shivered. He tossed the recipe out. Naturally, this led to a side career in sausage making, because of course it did. Historians still argue whether the ink registry protocols were based on legitimate chemistry or just centuries of stubborn ritual. Some say citrus was truly useful for stabilizing the pH of deteriorating samples. Others think librarians just enjoyed waving lemon peels dramatically, while muttering phrases like oxidative betrayal. Down in the registry, you find the damage. A cracked bottle of 1843 black walnut ink has leaked onto the corner of the Binding Theory of Marginalia, Volume 2. It's soaked into the cloth cover and is creeping across the shelf like a very slow spider. Wexley's already here, holding a lemon and looking sheepish. I nudge the shelf. He admits, barely. You don gloves and gently lift the damaged book. It drips onto your sleeve. It smells faintly of roasted acorns and disappointment. You bring it to the blotting station, where blotter paper, chalk dust, and a tray of silica packets await like a surgical team. The goal isn't perfection, it's triage. Slow the spread, prevent additional casualties. Convince the book it's love, even as it stains your notebook. You dab, you pat, you whisper kind things, then you assess the surrounding books. A copy of The Emotional Logic of Ink is unharmed but visibly nervous. You move it 3 inches to the left. Distance helps. Wexley fans lemon peel over the spill, just in case. He murmurs. The citrus gods might be watching. Once the mess is under control, you replace the cork in the cracked bottle, wrap it in cloth, and label it exhausted. Then you file a report with a sentence you've never written before. Ink contained. Only one known casualty. The citrus was useful, but not in the ways we expected. You pass Miss Pym in the hallway. She sniffs the air and frowns. Gall ink, she asks. Mostly walnut. You reply with notes of regret. She nods solemnly. It happens. Back upstairs. You log your shift. Wexley brings you tea, his version of an apology. It's chamomile and very slightly lemony. You sip, write the final line of your report, and look out the window as the clouds gather for a soft evening drizzle. Ink flows, but sometimes you get to redirect the current. You're just about to settle into your afternoon tea quiet. Chamomile. Guilt adjacent when the fire bell rings once. Not a real emergency, just a shelter breach, which, in the world of 19th century library protocols, usually means something is where it really should not be. This time, it's in the preservation vault. You button your coat, Tuck a lint brush into your sleeve like a knight might conceal a dagger, and descend into the vaults. You've only been down here once before. It smelled like dried thyme, binding glue, and suspiciously clean socks. Miss Plimsoll is already at the door. It's the vellum scroll, she whispers, like you're in a church. The 1647 one. You nod like that means something. Today's mainstream historical fact. Vellum parchment made from calfskin was still in use into the 19th century for ceremonial or archival texts. It was durable, beautiful, and temperamental. Libraries kept it under special conditions, often rolling and unrolling it by moonlight. A rule you suspect was invented during a wine-fueled staff party. Your quirky tidbit. A Scottish librarian once developed a method for testing vellum pliability using spoon handles and silence. If the vellum resisted curling when tapped thrice with a chilled spoon, it was at rest. If not, it was preparing rebellion. She documented this in a footnote no one has ever been able to replicate. Historians still argue whether these preservation rituals had any effect at all, or whether they were simply elaborate excuses to fund the Vellum Spoon Initiative under the royal budget. Back in the vault, you reach the offending scroll. It's unfurling slightly at one corner, dangerous behavior for a document of its age. Worse, it has moved 3 inches from its alignment peg. Miss Plimsoll looks like she's about to faint. You pull on the cotton gloves and whisper the only phrase the scroll recognizes. Easy now. You gently realign the edge. Not a fold, not a press, just suggestion. You place 2 tiny lead weights on the corners shaped like pigeons. Because of course they are, and wait. The scroll settles. Then you notice something strange. A faint impression beneath the scroll, almost invisible unless the light hits it just so. A watermark. You tilt the lamp. No, not a watermark. A doodle of what appears to be a goat with wings and a hat. You call Wexley. He arrives with his portable magnifier and a biscuit. Huh, he says. The Guild of Celestial Cartographers used winged goats as their emblem. Very hush-hush. He taps the parchment lightly with a thimble, possibly a tracing guide, or an inside joke. You leave a note for the Historical Anomalies Committee. Mark the incident as not destructive, but emotionally startling, and reseal the vault. Miss Plimsoll pats the scroll gently. You did well, she says. Would you like a spoon? You say yes. It's chilled, pewter, and shaped like a narwhal. You return upstairs, tuck the narwhal spoon into your satchel, and log the scroll incident with the line, Vellum returned to stillness. Winged goat confirmed. Plimsoll remains steadfast. Outside, the rain continues its delicate tap against the reading room windows. You sip your tea, slightly cold now, but comforting in its temperature and its persistence. You lean back, gaze at the ceiling, and wonder if anyone ever preserved joy in vellum. You're halfway through reorganizing the catalog cards for muff-related inventions of the 1830s when the lights flicker once, twice, and then settle into that moody, overcast sort of glow that says, something's wrong in periodicals. You already know what's coming. You grab your oilcloth apron, a small jar of lavender-scented glue, and a pair of boots. Not because they're needed, but because it helps you feel prepared, emotionally waterproof. You might say, your mainstream historical fact for today. By the mid-1800s, major libraries had begun subscribing to dozens, even hundreds of periodicals, journals, and newspapers. These were stored not just in stacks, but in specially designed drawers, file cabinets, and accordion folders that, more often than not, had personalities of their own. Your quirky tidbit. A Parisian library once designated a cat officially whose sole task was to sleep on top of the latest French poetry journals, thus discouraging readers from reaching for anything too avant-garde before breakfast. The cat was named Mauvais Goût. And yes, historians still argue whether the wild expansion of periodicals helped democratize knowledge or just gave librarians carpal tunnel from all the folding, stamping, and emotional fortification required. Down in the periodical's alcove, you find the issue. Literally, it's the darning Gazette. July 1849. One of the rare leather-bound editions with the infamous misprint on page 6 that refers to sock psychology instead of stock photography. It's lying askew, half open, cover twisted, one edge damp with what you sincerely hope is tea. Miss Pym stands nearby, looking guilty. I knocked over the shelf index. She admits, it startled the Gazette. You don your gloves and examine the scene. One drawer is fully open, another is slightly ajar, and someone's inserted Ye Olde Beekeepers Monthly, where hydraulic gnome mechanics clearly belongs. Disorder, chaos, muffled horror. You whisper reassurances to the Gazette as you gently blot the damp edge. You slide the misfiled gnome mechanics back into its home. With the same reverence some people reserve for holy relics, you straighten every volume. You restore the shelf index, an elaborate folding chart with coded tabs, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and linen starch. Then you turn to the real damage. The drawer labeled Misk, 1849-51. Socks, brooms, oranges. It's swollen, overstuffed. And not just with periodicals. There's a small muslin pouch inside, containing a crumbling biscuit, a flattened thimble, and a scrap of handwritten poetry about the seduction of a well-swept hearth. Wexley appears behind you. Ah, he says, drawer 8, that's Marigold's nest. You don't know who Marigold is. She's not staff, he adds, but she was fond of metaphors, and we didn't have the heart to stop her. You reseal the pouch, label it Non-Invasive Legacy, and return it to the drawer, this time tucked neatly alongside the December 1850 issue of Modest Candle Innovations Quarterly. Wexley offers to guard the drawer from further poetic incursion. You decline. Politely, back at your station, you re-ink the catalog cards, realign your magnifying glass, and write, drawer rebalanced, biscuit archived, misfiled gnome located. Outside, the wind makes the trees sway just slightly. Inside, the Gazette dries in the sunbeam. Page 6 fluttering gently as if to say, we all misprint things sometimes. There's a note pinned to your inkwell when you return from periodicals. The pin is shaped like a tulip, which means only one thing. Vault 3 needs attention. Again, Vault 3 is the quiet one. The one no one speaks about unless they absolutely have to. It is neither haunted nor cursed, it's simply moody. Dimmer than the others, always slightly colder than the rest of the building. And every so often, it releases a scent best described as elderberry plus wet shoes. You sigh, grab your brass key and a lidded candle, and make your way down the narrow stairwell. The walls hum. Your boots echo in a way that reminds you you're definitely underground. Here's your mainstream historical fact. 19th-century libraries often stored rare or controversial books in isolated vaults, kept under lock and key, not only to prevent theft, but to limit unsupervised access. Books on alchemy, birth control, or esoteric geometry were considered dangerous, or at least disruptive, to the well-curated sensibilities of polite society. And your quirky tidbit. In one London library, Vault D held a single book, Treatise on the Softness of Stones, which had caused 3 patrons to burst into tears. No one knows why. The book is mostly diagrams of pebbles and a poem about lint. Historians still argue whether these vaults were truly about preservation or simply a tidy way to avoid difficult questions like, why does this book scream when you open it? You reach Vault 3. The tulip pin's message was clear enough, but the door tells you more. Someone opened it recently and forgot to lock it properly. There's a faint draft. And yes, that unmistakable elderberry and shoe aroma. Inside, the book rests on its pedestal. It's open. You check the spine. Volume 2. Symbolic umbrellas and the shadows they cast. Classic Vault 3. You approach slowly, candle in hand. The pages are gently fluttering. Even though the air is still, you can see the passage someone left open to. If umbrellas conceal more than rain, what do they whisper to the wind? You close the book gently. It sighs. You return it to its silk wrap, rotating it 3 times clockwise the protocol, and place it back in the cradle. You weigh it down with a paperweight shaped like an apricot. You don't ask why. Vault 3 doesn't like questions. On the wall, you notice a new scratch about eye height, curving in an almost floral pattern. Wexley's voice drifts in behind you. Vault graffiti again, he asks, holding a cup of something steaming, possibly vinework. You reply, or dramatic sneezing. He nods, sets the drink on a stool, and hands you a cloth. You polish the lock, double-check the hinges, and seal the vault with a thud that echoes down the hallway like a closing sigh. Another incident contained. Back upstairs. You write, Vault 3 stabilized. Book soothed. Floral scratches inconclusive. You tuck the tulip pin into your satchel, next to the narwhal spoon. They clink like old friends. The library settles. The light outside begins to lean gold and pink, bouncing across the stained glass windows near the rare French dictionaries. You stretch, glance over your shoulder, and murmur something soft to the shelves. Just in case they're listening, the umbrella book sleeps again. Evening rolls in gently, like a well-dusted volume closing softly on its final page. You've just finished cataloging the last known issue of Whisker Maintenance Weekly. The 1873 edition includes a delightful fold-out diagram of mutton chop grooming techniques when the library gives a low creak. Not a dangerous creak, a contemplative one, the kind a house makes when it's tired but satisfied. You sit at your desk, reorganizing a stack of annotated margin scraps library patrons once left, these like breadcrumb trails for future readers. One reads simply, "This footnote feels dishonest." Your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1800s, many librarians were actively preserving ephemera bookmarks, notes, even reader graffiti as part of the intellectual atmosphere. They called it reader trace, and it was seen as a living record of thought. Your quirky tidbit. In a Warsaw library, one librarian was known to write polite replies in the margins of certain books, addressing earlier graffiti. "No, sir," she once scribbled, "the Countess was not a werewolf, she just had a limp and excellent posture." And historians still argue whether preserving these traces is meaningful cultural archaeology or just over-curated eavesdropping on paper. You finish transcribing a particularly snarky marginalia exchange from a 1791 copy of the highly questionable science of cloud weighing. The dialogue goes as follows. "Clouds do not weigh anything." Harold, "Yes, they do. I saw one fall. Ask the cows. You need new friends." Harold, you place the slip gently into the reader trace archive, then something gentle tugs at you, not a sound or breeze, but the sense that the library itself is nodding off. The light has gone lavender at the edges. Wexley appears with 2 mugs of warm barley milk. The librarian's version of a nightcap. You sip in silence. The warm mug hums slightly in your hands, as though absorbing the day's chaos. Miss Pym dims the chandelier over the central rotunda. Miss Plimsoll ties a fresh ribbon around the copy of Umbrella Topography and hums a lullaby meant for books, not people. And as the stillness deepens, you write your final entry of the day. All catalogs balanced, vaults closed, umbrellas dormant, no unauthorized sneezing. And then, so here you are, drifting on the edge of sleep, curled in the same gentle hush that once settled across rows of books and candle-lit desks, where librarians in soft-soled shoes tiptoed between shelves, muttering about humidity and the arrogance of staplers. You can almost hear the distant rattle of a rolling ladder, its wheels squeaking out a lullaby just for you. The lights are low now, just a flicker of warmth across the page margins, the kind that makes paper glow like memories. Outside, maybe it's raining, or maybe that's just the wind, brushing past the windows in a soft, familiar swoosh. And inside, in the heart of the library, you've been wandering all night. The air is thick with the scent of waxed wood, inky parchment, and lavender glue. The last chair is tucked in. The final drawer clicks shut. A vault hums behind stone. All is still. And you're safe, shelved in quiet, wrapped in vellum dreams. Every question has been filed, every sneeze documented. Even the winged goat is at peace. So let go now. Let your thoughts fade like ink on a well-loved page. Let the soft turning of imaginary paper carry you down into the dream shelves of some long-forgotten catalog, where nothing is urgent and everything is alphabetized just right. Good night, gentle listener. Sleep well.